Have you ever been part of a team, whether it was like a sports team, maybe your family, or even just a particular class at school, where you felt like being part of that group, it just shapes so much of who you are, what you do. Maybe it's that rush of pride when your school wins something,
Wow.
or the way you just naturally fall into step with your grade level team when there's a new challenge. You feel like you're all in it together.
Yeah, that collective feeling.
Exactly. Well, today we're diving deep into exactly that feeling.
Yeah.
Our central theme is the really profound impact of identity processes on how we function within groups and organizations too.
It's a field that's really gained huge momentum. You look at the key papers, thousands of citations. It shows it's not just some side issue. It's actually central to understanding organizational life in groups, really.
And our guide for this fascinating journey is an incredibly insightful academic chapter. It's titled Identity Processes in Organizations by S. Alexander Haslam and Naomi Elmers. It's from the Handbook of Identity Theory and Research.
And what's really fascinating here, I think, is that this research, it isn't just about, big faceless corporations or abstract structures that feel kind of distant.
Right, not just CEOs and boardrooms.
Not at all. It reveals these fundamental psychological processes that play out every single day, everywhere people gather, and that includes, very powerfully, the elementary school classroom.
Ah, okay, so bringing it right down to that level.
Absolutely. So our mission for you, our listener, especially if you're coming from, say, an elementary education background and you're newly curious about identity and psychology, our mission is to unearth some surprising insights. Insights into how our sense of self is deeply, deeply tied to the groups we belong to.
Okay.
And crucially, how understanding these dynamics can offer powerful new perspectives for you, especially when you think about it in a classroom setting. It truly changes how you see, everything from student motivation, teacher well-being, even the whole culture of a school.
Okay, let's unpack this then. It sounds captivating. Let's see what it means for how we understand ourselves and, the teams we're a part of, from sports teams to school teams and, even our individual classrooms.
Let's do it.
So, to begin, when we talk about identity, it often feels like something deeply individual, right? Something that's just about me.
Our personality, our talents.
Yeah, exactly. Our unique personality, our individual talents, personal beliefs. But this research, it sounds like it's suggesting it's, a lot more nuanced than that. Where does this journey into identity really start for social psychologists?
It really kicks off with the concept of social identity. And this grew from an awareness that social groups aren't just labels. They have this profound psychological reality. They're important.
Okay.
And Henri Tajfel, he's a really foundational figure here, he crystallized it. He defined social identity as, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, an individual's knowledge that he or she belongs to certain social groups.
Yeah, knowing you're in the group.
Together with some emotional and value significance to him or her of this group membership. So it's not just knowing it intellectually.
It's feeling it.
It's feeling it. It's deeply felt.
That's a really powerful definition. So what's the real leap here? Is it just being aware you're in a group, or does it go deeper into our emotions, how we actually define ourselves?
Oh, much deeper. The core idea here is that groups aren't just external things like, a sign on a building or a name on a list.
Right.
They become deeply internalized. They actually contribute directly to a person's sense of who they are.
Wow.
So this isn't just about belonging somewhere. It fundamentally redefines who we are. Our identity isn't just formed by us as individuals, but it's also significantly formed from the U.S. we choose to be part of.
Okay, so it's a reciprocal thing almost.
Absolutely. It's a profound psychological shift. And it underpins so much human behavior, way beyond just corporations or classrooms. Think about it. When we engage with these groups, like a school or a grade level team or even your specific classroom, we often talk about we and us.
Yeah, we decided, or us teachers think.
Exactly. And that's not just a casual metaphor. It speaks to aspects of those groups, those organizations that we perceive as real and important. And they profoundly impact our thoughts, our feelings, our actions.
I'm starting to see the connections. It explains why you hear teachers say, we, the third grade team, decided on this approach, or students proudly chanting, we are the Wildcats.
Yeah.
It suggests a really, really deep connection to that group identity.
Precisely.
So building on this, the research introduces something called self-categorization theory, SCT. How does that help us understand how we actually do that, how we categorize ourselves in these groups?
Right. SC2, developed mainly by John Turner, it really elaborates on this process. It basically posits that the self isn't just this single fixed thing. It can be perceived as a member of a particular class or category of stimuli. So sometimes I'm me, sometimes I'm S.
Yeah.
And what's really crucial here is the concept of depersonalization. Now, that sounds negative, but it doesn't mean losing your personality.
Right, it's not like becoming a robot.
No, not at all. It means that when our social identity is salient-like, when we're primarily thinking of ourselves as a group member, we tend to see ourselves as, in some ways, interchangeable with others in that group, at least on the dimensions relevant to the group identity.
Interchangeable. How so?
Well, a part of your self-concept becomes defined by these shared stereotypical attributes. Things like common values the group holds, shared goals, or typical behaviors that are characteristic of the group. You see yourself as a group member, defined by what makes the group distinct.
So it's about seeing yourself as similar to others in your group, and importantly, different from those outside it. It's almost like you take on the group's brand as part of your own identity in that moment.
Precisely. The source gives the example of a female dentist. When she categorizes herself as a dentist, she recognizes her similarity to other dentists, professional ethics, knowledge, goals, that kind of thing. And she also sees her distinctiveness from, say, patients or maybe doctors in a different field who operate in different professional categories. So social identity becomes this functional part of our self-definition. It helps us navigate the social world.
Makes sense.
And what's particularly insightful is that these identity-defining categories, they exist at different levels of abstraction, which impacts how broadly or narrowly we define our us at any given time.
That's fascinating. You know, we often default to thinking about identity as purely individual, that our true self is always just our unique traits.
The core me.
Yeah, the core me. But if groups become internalized, like you're saying, does that mean our identity isn't just one monolithic thing? Does the research break it down into different levels, maybe within an organization like a school?
It absolutely does. And this is where A.D. Brown's model from 2001 is incredibly helpful. Brown identifies 4 distinct levels of identity that are really relevant in organizational settings. And it challenges that tendency we have to prioritize individual identity as the most fundamental.
Okay, 4 levels. What are they?
First, we have the individual level. This is about a person's unique qualities, their personal aspirations, the distinct things that make them who they are within the organization, your personal brand, your unique talents, maybe your specific role.
So that's the me we often start with. Makes sense.
Exactly. Then we move up to the group level. This is about the shared identity that emerges within smaller, more immediate teams or sections, like a specific grade-level team in a school or a department, or even just a small project group working together.
Oh, okay. So the 3rd grade team or the science department.
Precisely. This groupness often involves shared norms, specific goals they're working on together, maybe a sense of camaraderie that's distinct from other groups in the same building.
Okay, so that's a step up from the individual, but still quite focused. What's next?
The 3rd level is the organizational level. This refers to the identity of the organization as a whole. So in your context, this would be the entire school, Maplewood Elementary, for example.
Right, the whole institution.
Yes. This identity covers the collective mission, the school's core values, its reputation in the community, the things that define the entire institution and ideally bind everyone within it together. It's the overarching who we are as a school.
And finally, the broadest level. What's the 4th one?
That's the cultural level. This reflects commonalities and identity across multiple organizations or within a broader societal context. So, for instance, the identity of being an educator in society.
Like the teaching profession as a whole.
Exactly. Or being part of the broader K-12 system in a particular region or country. This identity reflects shared professional values, societal roles, collective experiences that kind of transcend individual schools.
Okay, that makes sense. Individual, group, organizational, cultural.
And what's really crucial here, getting back to self-categorization theory, is that SCT argues that identities at all these levels are equally real. They all reflect a person's true self, depending on the context.
That's a big point.
It is. It fundamentally goes against that common tendency to see individual identity as the most fundamental or the most authentic. SCT says no single level of self-categorization is inherently more appropriate or useful than another. And none is more fundamental to who a person actually is.
Wow.
This perspective really shakes up traditional views in psychology, which often give this sort of privileged status to personal identity.
That's a crucial takeaway then. It means that my true self isn't always just my individuality. It can be just as truly defined by being a third-grade teacher or a Maplewood Elementary staff member or even just a caring educator in a broader sense, depending on the situation.
Precisely. Who you are depends on who you are with and who you are comparing yourself to.
Okay, so what does this all mean for someone thinking about a classroom? Can we ground this? Let's take that first step towards a practical example in a school setting.
Absolutely. Let's make it concrete. If you think about your own school, the people in it, you can see all four levels of identity constantly at play, shaping behavior, shaping interactions every single day.
Okay, let's try it. Imagine your school. First, the individual level. Think about a unique student, maybe one known for their incredible creativity, always drawing or writing stories. Or maybe one known for their quiet diligence, always focused. Or perhaps their infectious enthusiasm for, I don't know, science experiments.
Right, those unique traits, that's their individual identity. It's what makes them stand out as a distinct person among their classmates.
Then consider a specific class, say a third-grade class. They might develop a shared identity. Perhaps they become known as Mr. Harrison's amazing readers because they're really excelling at reading challenges. Or maybe the eco-warriors of Room 204 because they started a recycling project.
Yeah, they get a nickname, maybe a class chant.
Exactly. This is their group identity. It's distinct from other classes down the hall or maybe even other teams within the school. They share specific norms, maybe inside jokes, a collective sense of purpose that sets them apart.
Okay, group level covered.
Then the entire school. Let's stick with Maplewood Elementary. It also has its own identity. Maybe it's known across the district for its strong arts program, or maybe its unwavering commitment to community service, lots of volunteer projects, or perhaps its innovative approach to using technology and learning.
That's the organizational identity. It's the collective sense of who the school is as a whole, what it stands for, its unique culture that kind of permeates every classroom and hallway. It's the school's brand.
Right. And finally, the cultural level, being an educator in society or being part of the broader K-12 system in your state or country, that's a cultural identity.
Yeah. This reflects those commonalities across many schools, across the teaching profession itself. It shapes how you, as a teacher, see your role in the larger world, maybe your professional ethics, your commitment to students no matter which specific school you happen to be in. All these levels contribute to an individual's sense of self, influencing their behavior, their motivation, how they interact with others in really profound ways.
Okay, that framework, individual, group, organizational, cultural, really helps clarify things. It's not just me or them. There are layers of us.
Exactly. Layers of potential self-definition.
This leads us to something truly fascinating in the research. This fundamental drive we seem to have to be special, not just as individuals, but as groups. Why do groups matter so much to us, even when, on the surface, they seem almost, well, meaningless? This brings us to the minimal group effect. I'm curious, how minimal can a group actually be to still have this kind of impact?
The minimal group studies, they're a real cornerstone finding from social identity theory stemming from Henri Tajfel's really ingenious studies back in the early 1970s.
Okay.
He basically wanted to figure out the absolute bare minimum conditions needed to get people to favor their own group over another group.
Right, to strip everything else away.
Exactly. So these studies involved creating groups that had absolutely no prior meaning, no obvious self-relevance for the people in them, and crucially, no interaction at all between the members.
No interaction. How do they even form groups then?
Well, it was often based on something completely trivial, like participants might be told they were grouped based on whether they overestimated or underestimated the number of dots flashed on a screen.
Seriously, dots on a screen.
Or sometimes based on a supposed preference for one abstract painting over another, paintings by artists they'd never heard of, like Klee or Kandinsky. There was no personal interaction, no shared history, no future consequence tied to being in the group. It was purely categorization.
And what did he find from these almost absurdly simple groupings? What happened?
The finding was robust, consistent, and honestly pretty astonishing at the time. Even these most stripped-down minimal conditions were enough to encourage in-group favoring responses.
Wow.
Participants would consistently allocate more points, or sometimes token amounts of money, to anonymous members of their own arbitrarily assigned group than they would to members of the other group.
Even if they didn't know who they were giving it to.
Completely anonymous, just member #7 of the Klee group versus member #4 of the Kandinsky group. And sometimes they'd even do this if it meant they themselves, the person allocating, got less in absolute terms.
No way. So they'd sacrifice their own gain just to make sure their group came out ahead.
In some conditions, yes. The mere act of categorizing oneself as a group member was enough to produce in-group favoritism.
That is incredible.
It's a fundamental point. It shows that having a shared social identity isn't just some byproduct of already existing group relations. It's the psychological underpinning that actually makes group behavior possible in the first place.
Okay.
So in organizational contexts, like a school, it's what makes collective action achievable. Even from the most fragile beginnings, just labeling people as part of Team A versus Team B can start these processes rolling. It's almost like our brains are just wired to latch on to us versus them distinctions.
That's incredibly powerful. It suggests that our tendency to favor us over them is almost baked in, even if us is just a random collection of people who supposedly like the same painting.
It seems to be a very fundamental human tendency.
And the source even cites that study by R.J. Brown from 1978 about wage negotiations, where professional groups would literally sacrifice absolute financial gain just to preserve their group's relative advantage over other groups.
Yeah, that study's a classic. They cared more about being paid more than the other group, even if it meant getting a smaller raise overall for themselves.
That's a profound aha moment right there. Our drive for a positive group identity, to feel like our group is special or superior, can actually override even rational individual self-interest, like getting more money.
Exactly. It really highlights that when people categorize themselves as part of a group, they are fundamentally motivated to establish a social identity that is perceived as positive and also distinct.
Positive and distinct.
They want their group to feel special, to be seen in a positive light and to differentiate itself favorably from other relevant groups, and they will behave in ways, sometimes quite surprising ways, to establish its superiority over other groups, and then to protect that superiority over time.
And this is why organizations, like schools, spend time crafting mission statements, right? And public pronouncements that make us seem different from, and often, let's be honest, implicitly or explicitly better than them, the other schools or districts.
Absolutely. Think of school slogans like excellence in action, or home of the champions, or a tradition of success. They're all about defining a positive and distinct identity for the collective.
And I can see now how this drive to protect a positive group identity leads directly to resistance when organizational change comes along.
Oh, hugely.
If teachers or staff members' identity is tightly tied to a specific unit, like, say, a long-standing department, or a familiar grade level they've been part of for years, then changes like mergers, restructuring, even shifts in curriculum policy, they can feel deeply threatening.
Exactly, because those changes might devalue or even completely eliminate the original self-defining group.
It's not just about new procedures. It's about losing us.
Precisely. The loss or devaluation of an organizational identity where a group that defined part of yourself no longer exists in its original form or is seen as less important, that can be a profound source of stress, disaffection, resistance. People aren't just resisting a new structure on logical grounds, they are often protecting their established positive group identities, which are fundamental to their sense of self-worth and belonging within that organization.
That makes so much sense. It explains why sometimes change initiatives that seem logical on paper just hit a wall of resistance.
It's often because the social identity dynamics haven't been considered. It's not enough to just explain the logic of the change. You have to manage the identity threat that people might be feeling.
Okay. So given this deep-seated drive for a positive, distinct, and enduring identity, what strategies do people use when their group status isn't exactly ideal? Maybe they're in a lower status group. The source mentions three main ones, depending on how permeable the group boundaries seem and how stable or legitimate the group's current status feels. Can you walk us through those?
Yes. Social identity theory outlines three really distinct strategies people pursue to achieve or maintain a positive social identity, especially when their current group identity isn't providing that. The first one is individual mobility.
Okay, mobility, moving.
Exactly. This strategy tends to apply when individuals perceive the boundaries between their group and a higher status group as permeable, meaning they believe it's actually possible for them as an individual to leave their current low status group and join a higher status one.
So if I'm in a group that feels less than, and I see a clear path out for myself personally, I'll try to take it.
Right. In this scenario, individuals will tend to act alone. They focus on their personal efforts, their individual qualifications or performance to seek a new, more positive group identity by moving up.
The source gives that example of a woman in a very male-dominated workplace.
Yeah.
She might act like one of the boys, maybe downplay her gender identity to try and get ahead individually to gain preferment and climb the ladder within that system.
That's a classic illustration. In that specific context, she's prioritizing her individual advancement, potentially over-expressing solidarity with her original group identity, because she sees a path for individual mobility.
Okay, let's translate that to a classroom, individual mobility.
Mm.
Imagine a student who feels like their current reading group, let's call them the Bluebirds, is struggling. Maybe they always finish activities last, or they feel they get picked last for presentations.
Right, a lower status group in the classroom hierarchy.
Yeah. Now, if this student sees a clear path to join the Greenhawks, who are known for being strong readers, maybe the teacher says, if you reach this reading level, you can move up. Or if you consistently get high scores on comprehension quizzes.
Okay, so there's a perceived permeable boundary.
Right. Then that student might work extra hard individually. They'd spend more time reading at home, practice difficult words, maybe seek out extra help from the teacher, all to prove they can move up. They're engaging in individual mobility, using their personal effort to achieve a more positive identity by joining that higher status group.
And a teacher might observe this as a student becoming maybe very focused on their individual scores or achievements, possibly less focused on helping their current Bluebird teammates.
Makes perfect sense. Okay, that's strategy one. Move up alone if you can. What's the second strategy then, for when mobility isn't really an option?
The second strategy is called social creativity. This comes into play if the group boundaries are seen as impermeable, meaning membership is fixed, you can't easily leave, your low status seems inescapable, but, and this is key, the social relations are perceived as secure.
Secure, meaning?
Meaning the status differences, while maybe not liked, are seen as stable and generally legitimate. Like that's just the way things are and it's not likely to change soon.
Okay, so you're stuck in the lower group,
Yeah.
and the hierarchy seems fixed. What do?
In this situation, low-status groups engage in social creativity. They basically accentuate positivity on alternative, status-irrelevant dimensions. They find new ways to feel good about their group.
So if you can't change your group or its status on the main dimension everyone focuses on, you find something else to be proud of. Like the examples in the source. Okay, we may not be as wealthy or as intelligent or as qualified as them, but hey, we're more down to earth, we're friendlier, we're kinder.
Exactly. You shift the criteria for evaluation to dimensions where your group excels or can claim superiority.
Right. Find a different playing field where you can win.
Precisely. The source mentions a study of a hospital merger. Employees from the lower status hospital, they knew they couldn't really compete on clinical excellence with the bigger, more prestigious hospital they were merging with. So what did they do?
What?
They compensated by highlighting their superiority in things like friendliness and sociability. They might have the fancy equipment, but we really care about our patients.
Social creativity in action.
Another vivid example is people doing what sociologists call dirty work jobs that might be considered low status or unpleasant by society. They creatively redefine their occupations to focus on positives. Garbage collectors might emphasize working outdoors, physical activity. Dog catchers might highlight flexible hours, interacting with animals. Exotic dancers might focus on meeting new people or artistic expression. They're redefining what makes their group special by shifting the focus away from the potentially negative societal view.
Okay, that's really clever. So for a classroom example of social creativity, let's think about maybe the school play crew versus the varsity football team, especially in a school that puts immense value on athletic achievement.
Right. A clear status hierarchy there in many schools.
Yeah. The play crew, they might readily acknowledge, okay, we aren't the big sports stars of the school. They probably can't change that hierarchy. But they might emphatically emphasize their creativity, their collaborative spirit, their unique artistic expression, or the way they bring diverse stories to life for the whole school.
Finding their own niche to value.
Exactly. They might say something like, we might not win championships on the field, but we create magic on stage. We bring poignant stories to life. We are the heart of the school's culture, enriching everyone's lives in a way sports just can't. They're finding a different dimension, artistry, collaboration, cultural impact on which to claim superiority and positive distinctiveness for their group.
That's a perfect example of social creativity, redefining the grounds for comparison.
Okay, so Individual mobility
Yeah.
if you can leave, social creativity if you're stuck,
Yeah.
but the system feels stable. What's the third strategy?
The third strategy is social competition. This tends to occur when group boundaries are seen as impermeable, so you can't leave your group, and social relations are perceived as insecure.
Insecure, meaning unstable or illegitimate.
Exactly. The low status is perceived as unstable, maybe things are changing, or more commonly as illegitimate. Unfair. Not right. Undeserved.
Okay, so you can't leave, and you feel the system is unfair and shouldn't be this way. What happens then?
Here, low-status groups are much less willing to just accept their status. They will actively define themselves by their group membership to directly challenge the outgroup, the higher status group. This often involves head-on conflict, direct confrontation, collective action aimed at overthrowing the existing hierarchy or changing the status quo.
So you fight back. As a group, the source mentions that experimental research by Wright where low-status groups pursued collective conflict when individual access to high-status groups was impossible, and the high-status group's behavior seemed illegitimate.
Precisely. If the higher status group tries to manage this by promoting maybe just a few token members from the low status group to appear permeable.
Oh, like window dressing.
Kind of.
Yeah.
That might reduce the likelihood of collective challenge in the short term. But if the perceived unfairness or illegitimacy is really clear and widespread, and the path to genuine individual mobility is effectively blocked for most people, then collective action, social competition becomes far more likely. People band together to demand change.
Okay, let's try a classroom example for social competition. This one feels a bit more intense. Consider a scenario where one group of students, maybe they've been placed in a struggling learners reading group, and they consistently feel overlooked or unfairly treated by the teacher. Compared to another group, maybe the gifted group, that seems to get more praise, more resources, more interesting tasks.
Okay, a perceived illegitimate status difference.
Right. And if they perceive no individual way to gain fair recognition, maybe the teacher just doesn't seem to notice their efforts and they can't use social creativity because maybe the struggling label feels deeply negative and hard to redefine positively. And crucially, they feel the system is genuinely unfair and illegitimate.
What might they do?
They might collectively challenge the teacher's authority. This could manifest in different ways. Maybe the whole group starts refusing to participate in certain activities. Or they might openly question assignments during class. Why do we always get the boring worksheets? Or they might subtly undermine classroom rules by banding together, maybe talking out of turn as a group, or not following instructions collectively.
A coordinated resistance.
Yeah, it's a coordinated attempt to change their group status, or at the very least, to challenge the perceived unfairness of the system. This collective defiance, even on a small scale, is a form of social competition.
That illustrates it well. Those three strategies, mobility, creativity, competition, really cover the range of responses based on how people perceive the group structure and their place within it.
Okay, this is really clarifying how identity drives behavior in response to group status. But it leads to another crucial point. When do these identities, individual, group, organizational, cultural, actually become real to us? Like prominent in our minds and guiding our behavior in any given moment. It's about identity salience, right?
Exactly.
Salience.
It feels like my identity as a parent is salient when I'm at home dealing with my kids, but my identity as a podcast host or maybe teacher is salient when I'm working. How does that shift actually happen? What makes one identity pop into the foreground?
That's an excellent observation, and it's precisely what self-categorization theory, SCT, helps us understand. SCT focuses on identity salience as an interaction. It's an interaction between two core processes. Perceiver readiness, which is sometimes called accessibility, and fit.
Readiness and fit. Okay, let's break those down. What's perceiver readiness?
Perceiver readiness is basically about what we bring into the situation. It comes from our past experiences, our enduring sense of self, our current goals. It's about how easily available or accessible that particular identity is in our minds.
So if I've identified strongly as a teacher for years, that identity is more ready to become salient in relevant situations. That's right. We're more likely to use an identity if it has prior meaning for us, if it aligns with our long-term expectations and goals, and if it contributes to an enduring, stable sense of who we are. The source notes, for example. You're much more likely to define yourself as a psychologist if you've been working as one for a long time and you're currently at a psychology conference.
Right. Makes sense.
Rather than if you're, say, at a football match. Your strong identification with a particular category, like your work team or your school, makes that category more cognitively ready to be used to define yourself across various situations where it might be relevant. It's about the internal cognitive priming of an identity based on its importance to you.
Okay, so readiness is about internal factors, our personal history with that identity. What about fit? How does the external context, the situation itself, trigger a particular identity to become salient?
Right. Fit is about the connection between the identity and the current reality. And fit has two critical dimensions: comparative fit and normative fit.
Comparative and normative. Okay.
Yeah.
What's imperative?
Comparative fit basically means that the likelihood of using a social category to define yourself increases when the differences within that category seem smaller than the differences between that category and other relevant categories present in the situation.
Okay, say that again. Differences within are smaller than differences between.
Yeah. In essence, the category becomes salient when it highlights a clear us versus them distinction in the immediate context. It maximizes the perceived differences between groups and minimizes the perceived differences within your own group.
So it's about seeing the members of us as relatively similar to each other compared to how different they are from us.
Exactly. The source gives the example that teachers in different schools, when they get together, say at a district meeting, they're more likely to define themselves primarily as teachers, that's the US, versus other professions like lawyers or doctors, that's the them.
Right, the shared profession becomes the defining feature in that context.
Yes. Compared to, say, when they are back in their own school, where the category employee of this specific school might become more salient if they're comparing themselves to employees of a rival school. The context dictates the comparison.
Okay, let's try a classroom example for comparative fit. Imagine you're at a big district-wide teacher conference. You're surrounded by educators from dozens of different schools.
Okay.
When you meet teachers from other schools, you're likely to identify pretty strongly as just a teacher or an educator in general.
The broader category.
Yeah, the differences between individual schools, maybe one is urban, one is rural, one focuses on arts, one on STEM, those differences become less important than your shared identity as an educator compared to, say, the business professionals or software engineers who might also be at the conference hotel.
Right. Us educators versus them non-educators.
Exactly. But then, when you're back in your own school building, maybe you're in a meeting specifically with your grade level team. Now the comparative fit shifts. You might identify much more strongly as a kindergarten teacher compared to a fifth grade teacher down the hall.
Because the relevant comparison group has changed.
Right. Now the differences within the school system between grade levels become more salient because the immediate context highlights those distinctions.
That's a great illustration.
And I can see how this also explains the idea of fault lines in diverse groups. You know, when multiple characteristics like maybe age, gender, type of training all line up together. So you have a subgroup of, say, young, female, university-educated teachers and another subgroup of older male teachers with vocational training.
Right, when those attributes converge.
Yeah, it seems like that would create really clear subgroups. The differences between those subgroups become really pronounced, increasing the comparative fit of those specific sub-identities. And that could potentially lead to more distinct group formation, maybe even internal friction, if those subgroups have different goals or perspectives.
You've understood it perfectly. That's exactly how fault lines can emerge and strengthen based on comparative fit. Now, the other dimension of fit is normative fit.
Normative fit, what's that about?
This relates more to the meaningfulness of the category content in a specific context. In other words, does using this category help predict how individuals within it will respond or behave? Does it align with the stereotypical expectations we have of that group in this situation?
So it's about whether the identity provides useful information for understanding the situation and predicting behavior based on group norms.
Precisely. For example, the distinction between managers versus workers is far more likely to have high normative fit and thus predict people's positions when the topic is unpaid overtime.
Right, you expect different views there.
Than it is if the topic is something like choosing the snacks for the office canteen. The category of manager or worker has clear normative implications for attitudes towards labor and compensation, but probably not for snack preferences.
Got it. So it's about whether the identity makes sense and is relevant to the issue at hand. Okay, let's try a classroom example for normative fit. Consider a discussion in the staff room about a brand new grading policy. Maybe it requires significant changes to how teachers record and report student progress.
Okay, a potentially contentious issue.
Right. In that discussion, the distinction between, say, veteran teachers and new teachers is likely to have strong normative fit. You would probably predict different viewpoints.
How so?
Well, you might expect veteran teachers, maybe with years of established practices, to express concerns about the disruption, the workload, maybe the validity of the new system, while newer teachers might be more open to the innovation, perhaps less invested in the old ways. Their experience level and norm associated with the category matters here.
Makes sense. The category predicts likely stances.
Exactly. But now imagine the discussion shifts to the best type of coffee for the staff room Keurig machine. In that context, the veteran teacher versus new teacher distinction probably has very low normative fit.
Right, being experienced doesn't predict coffee preference.
No. It wouldn't predict who prefers dark roast versus medium or who wants decaf. Other categories, like maybe strong coffee lovers versus tea drinkers or people who avoid caffeine, those categories would be much more relevant and have higher normative fit for that particular discussion.
A perfect illustration of how the topic and context dictate which identities provide meaningful normative information. The source also presents a diagram, figure 30.1, showing this whole dynamic interrelationship. It really emphasizes that identity salience and our longer-term organizational identification are dynamically interrelated.
So it's a loop.
Kind of. Your enduring identification with a group makes it more ready. Then, current conditions, the comparative and normative fit of the situation, determine which identity becomes salient right now. And when an identity does become salient and guides your behavior...
It reinforces the identification for the future.
Exactly. It's a continuous feedback loop. Your behavior shapes your identity, and your identity shapes your behavior. They co-create each other over time.
Okay, that's really helpful. Readiness plus fit determines salience, and salience reinforces identification.
Got it. Now, beyond just which identity is salient, there's also this concept of prototypicality. This seems to be about who or what best embodies us, who's the ideal example of the group. That's right, prototypicality. Categories, especially social categories, aren't usually all or nothing. They have an internally graded structure, meaning some features or some individuals define the category better than others. They are seen as more prototypical.
More representative.
Exactly, more representative of what the group stands for or what's typical of the group. And the crucial point here is that who appears to be most like us, most prototypical, isn't fixed. It's not an inherent trait of a person.
It depends on the context.
It depends entirely on who we are comparing ourselves to at that moment and on what specific dimensions or characteristics we are making that comparison.
So a person's prototypicality isn't a fixed trait they possess, but rather changes with the context and the comparison being made. The source gives that interesting example of an administrator who is maybe quite intellectual. That administrator might be seen as highly prototypical of an administrator when compared to, say, the office cleaners.
Yeah.
Because the intellectual difference is really salient in that comparison.
Right. Administrators are thinkers versus cleaners are doers, perhaps.
Yeah. But that same intellectual administrator might be seen as less prototypical when the comparison group changes to, say, university academics.
Ah, because now the academics are seen as even more intellectual.
Right. So in that context, maybe a more practical, hands-on administrator, someone who really excels at managing budgets, logistics, getting things done, might suddenly become more prototypical of the administrator group, precisely because those practical managerial dimensions are now the relevant points of contrast with the academics.
That nails it. The prototype shifts based on the comparison context.
Okay, let's try a classroom example for prototypicality. Think about what defines a good student in your class. The prototype might change.
How so?
Well, when you're comparing students, say, to those who rarely turn in homework, maybe are disruptive or really struggle with basic concepts, the prototype of a good student might be someone who consistently completes assignments on time, participates respectfully, shows steady effort, even if their grades aren't always perfect.
Okay, so the diligent, compliant student is the prototype in that comparison.
Right, that's one prototype. The baseline, maybe. But the prototype can shift dramatically, can't it?
Absolutely, depending on the comparison.
So if you're comparing students, maybe thinking about those who are going on to top universities or who are excelling in advanced placement classes, the good student prototype might shift. It might now be someone who is not just diligent, but also highly analytical, maybe really innovative in their thinking, a critical thinker who asks insightful questions, perhaps even someone who challenges conventional ideas constructively.
A different set of valued characteristics becomes central.
Exactly. The context, the specific comparison being made, and the criteria that are valued in that comparison changes who best represents the ideal student identity, and therefore who is most prototypical of being a good student in that specific context. It just highlights how fluid and context-dependent our perceptions of group members and even group ideals can be.
It really underscores that these identities aren't static labels, they're active processes shaped by context.
This brings us to the real power of shared identity, how it transforms individuals acting alone into a collective, into a we actually doing things together. What happens once an identity becomes salient and people start perceiving themselves as part of this collective us?
Okay, so this is where it gets really impactful. Once a particular organizational identity, or maybe a team identity, has become salient for a group of people, it has these profound consequences. It doesn't just reshape individual psychology, how people think and feel.
It leads to actual stuff happening.
Yes, it translates into concrete collective products. Things like shared plans the group develops, coordinated services they deliver, maybe even new institutions or structures they build together, and also those deeply ingrained cultural norms we talked about.
So the shared identity provides a foundation.
A powerful foundation. It provides a basis for people to perceive and interpret the world in similar ways, because they're looking through the same group lens. And this naturally leads to mutual social influence. We become more easily influenced by fellow in-group members and much more coordinated behavior.
And those people who seem most prototypical, they gain influence.
Exactly. Individuals who are seen to really embody the meaning of us, those who are highly prototypical for the group in that context, they are naturally looked to for guidance. People trust them, listen to them more, precisely because they seem to represent that shared reality that binds the group together.
It's like individual opinions start to morph into social facts.
Yeah.
The source has those great examples, how a private thought like, I think it's important to work overtime can become, it is important to work overtime.
Yes.
Or I think we are the best. Shifts into the collective belief we are the best.
Yeah.
The individual belief transforms into a group truth, almost objective seeming.
That's a perfect way to put it. This identity-based social influence is absolutely central to transforming those idiosyncratic individual views into consensual, as if objective views. It's how individual inputs, private opinions, attitudes, beliefs get transformed into higher-order organizational products. Things like shared norms, core values, a distinctive organizational culture, a unified sense of purpose. It's how a group develops its own internal logic and its own shared reality.
And this sounds incredibly beneficial for communication and collaboration within a team. That's something every educator is striving for, right? In their classroom groups or in their staff teams.
Oh, absolutely. The research is very consistent here. Factors that increase social identity salience, like fostering a strong sense of team membership, they make people, 1, more willing to communicate with each other in the first place.
Okay, more open channels?
2, more open to others' communications, more receptive. And 3, crucially, more likely to interpret communications in the intended spirit, less likely to assume negative intent or misinterpret things.
That reduces so much friction.
Exactly. It builds trust. And this open communication also fosters the development of shared understandings. Researchers call these things like transactive memory systems, knowing who knows what in the group, or shared mental models, having a common understanding of the task and how to approach it.
So everyone's on the same page.
Right. And these shared understandings allow groups to produce collaborative products that far exceed what any individual could achieve alone. Team members implicitly know who knows what. They understand each other's roles. They can anticipate each other's actions. It allows for really seamless coordination.
You know, this is why there's such a massive difference between having a team of champions and being a champion team.
That's a fantastic way to put it.
The first one might have all the individual talent in the world, but the second one has that crucial we-ness, that shared identity that makes them click.
Exactly. The team of champions might have excellent individuals, each brilliant in their own right, but maybe they function as separate stars, possibly even competing with each other. But the champion team, they leverage that shared identity. It creates something genuinely greater than the sum of its parts through true synergy, coordination, and mutual support.
The source mentions this idea of a collective mind, seen in flight deck crews. That sounds intense.
Yeah, research by people like Carl Weick and Kathleen Roberts observed this in aircraft carrier flight decks, an incredibly high-pressure, high-stakes environment.
I can imagine.
What they found was that the crew's shared identity-based understanding of roles, relationships, responsibilities, who does what, who reports to whom, what the shared goal is, allowed them to trust each other implicitly. They could work at incredibly high intensity, making split-second decisions without constant verbal checking or micromanagement. They operated almost as a single, coordinated unit. That's the power of a deeply shared identity in action.
Wow, okay, let's bring that down to a classroom group project. Imagine a group of students working on, say, a complex science fair project. If they truly develop a shared identity, maybe they call themselves the innovators of Room 204, and they're all passionately committed to winning the fair, to pushing the boundaries of discovery together.
Okay, a strong shared goal and identity.
Yeah. You'd observe really distinct behaviors, right? They'll probably communicate more openly, brainstorm freely without fear of judgment. They'd actively support each other's contributions, maybe jump in to help if someone's struggling with a part. They'd spontaneously pick up slack for teammates who are maybe having an off day.
Real teamwork.
Exactly. Their individual talents would coalesce into a truly impressive champion team project. Something far more sophisticated, more well-executed than what any one student could likely have done alone. They'd internalize the group's success as their own, feeling real pride in that collective achievement.
That sounds ideal.
But now contrast that with a team of champions. Maybe the teacher just grouped together all the individual high achievers, forced them together, but they lack that shared innovator's identity.
Right, just a collection of smart individuals.
What might you see then? Maybe they struggle with coordination. Maybe they hoard information because they're focused on getting individual credit. Perhaps they even compete internally, subtly undermining each other.
Yeah, you see that happen.
So while each student might be brilliant individually, they'd work more in parallel rather than truly collaborating. And the outcome? Probably a less cohesive project, maybe less innovative, potentially less successful overall. They lack that underlying shared identity and the trust, the common framework that comes from it. True synergy becomes almost impossible.
And the difference isn't in their individual skills or intelligence. It's entirely in their shared sense of self as a group, or the lack thereof.
That really drives the point home. It's the we that makes the magic happen.
It often is.
This is truly foundational stuff, and I can already see how it connects to so many aspects of a school's day-to-day operations. But let's dig even deeper now into 3 specific areas where these identity processes have really profound practical impact: leadership, motivation, and stress.
Okay, 3 big ones.
Let's start with leadership. The traditional view, it often focuses on the great leader as this exceptional individual with special traits, almost a heroic figure standing apart from the crowd. How does a social identity approach challenge that widely held belief?
Yeah, you're right. Traditionally, leadership theories have often focused on the individual traits or the unique psychology of great leaders, seeing leadership as something arising from a distinctive personality, maybe charisma, intelligence, dominance, that sets them apart from ordinary followers.
The born leader idea.
Kind of, yeah. But here's the kicker. The empirical support for this individual trait approach is surprisingly weak. Decades of research have generally failed to identify any particular personality profile that reliably predicts who will emerge as a leader across different situations, or who will be consistently effective once they are in a leadership role.
Really? So there's no consistent leader personality?
Not one that holds up strongly across the board. It suggests leadership isn't just about an inherent fixed gift that some people possess and others don't.
So if it's not about the individual's unique brilliance or personality alone, what is it about? Does the social identity approach redefine leadership as more of a group dynamic?
Yes, profoundly. In stark contrast to those individualistic accounts, a social identity approach sees leadership not as a process revolving around individuals acting in isolation, but fundamentally as a group process. It argues that leaders and followers are joined together by a shared identity. They see themselves as part of the same us, working towards a common goal, engaged in a collaborative endeavor. And leaders exert influence not primarily through their I-ness, their personal traits or individual power, but by representing what we means. By embodying the group's identity and by actively promoting the collective interests and goals.
They become the symbol of us.
In a very real sense, yes. They become the embodiment of the group's shared aspirations and values in that particular context.
So it's really about the leader's ability to embody the group's identity. This connects directly to that idea we discussed earlier of leaders as in-group prototypes, right?
Exactly. The core idea is that the more prototypical a person is of a group, that is, the more they are seen by group members as embodying what the group stands for, its values, its ideals, its norms in that specific context, the more influence they will exert over other members.
And prototypicality isn't fixed.
Right, we established that. It varies with the social context who the comparison group is. Research by Plato and his colleagues, for instance, showed that followers' support for leaders changes depending on the context.
How so?
Well, in contexts where it's just about the in-group where the focus is internal, people tend to prefer leaders who treat fellow in-group members fairly and promote internal harmony. Makes sense, right?
Keep the peace within us.
But in intergroup contexts where there's an explicit us versus them dynamic, maybe a competition, a conflict, a rivalry.
Like school sports teams competing.
Exactly. In those situations, followers will often prefer leaders who actively favor the in-group, maybe by allocating more rewards or resources to us, even if it means being unfair to the outsiders.
Even if it's unfair.
Yes, because those actions help to differentiate the in-group positively against the out-group. It reinforces the specialness of us compared to them, which, as we know, is a core motivation.
That's a powerful distinction. It shows that what makes a leader effective, or at least influential, isn't just their personal qualities in a vacuum. It's how well those qualities resonate with the group's identity in that specific context, and critically, whether they are perceived to be acting for the group's benefit.
Precisely. It's about advancing the collective cause.
The source even mentions an experiment where participants actually voted for a considerate, but frankly unintelligent in-group leader over an intelligent out-group leader.
Right. And why? Because the in-group leader's traits, even the lack of intelligence, were presented in a way that promoted a valued group identity in that specific experimental setup.
That clearly highlights that these leadership preferences stem from contextually defined social identities, not from some abstract list of ideal individual leadership qualities.
It really does. Okay, let's try a classroom example of a leader as an in-group prototype. In a classroom, the class leader, and this could be someone formally elected for a project, or just an informal opinion leader everyone listens to, might be the student who best embodies the class's shared norms and aspirations at that time.
Yeah.
So maybe if the class really values academic effort, the leader is the most hardworking student. If they value creativity, it's the most artistic kid. Now imagine the class is competing in a school-wide fundraiser, trying to earn money for a class trip they all want.
Okay, a clear us versus them, other classes, context with a shared goal.
Right. In that context, the student who pushes tirelessly for the class to raise the most money, who organizes bake sales, encourages everyone constantly, maybe even makes some individual sacrifices for the collective goal. That student might suddenly be seen as the most prototypical and influential leader.
Even if they aren't usually the leader.
Even if they aren't. Because in that context, they embody the class's shared goal of winning and achieving something together. Their actions align perfectly with the we that the class is trying to be in that moment.
Got it. And leaders aren't just passive embodiments of identity. The research says they actively shape it. They're described as entrepreneurs of identity.
Yeah.
That sounds like they're actually building the very narrative of us.
Exactly. That's a really important part of the theory. Leaders aren't just chosen because they happen to be prototypical. Effective leaders actively work to define and redefine identity. They skillfully restructure social contexts, they use rhetoric, they create narratives to increase their own in-group prototypicality, and also to make their group appear positive and distinct.
So they frame the situation.
Yes. They often argue for specific us versus them categorizations that define the situation in a way that favors their group and makes them look like the natural leader for that group. The source provides that powerful historical example with Margaret Thatcher during the miners' strike in Britain in the 80s.
Right, how she framed it.
She successfully defined her government as representing a moderate and responsible majority of the nation, opposing what she framed as an organized revolutionary minority of thugs and bullies among the miners. That rhetoric wasn't just descriptive, it was highly prescriptive. It aimed to make her and her party prototypical of a valued national identity, responsible majority, while contrasting it with a devalued other.
Wow, that's identity entrepreneurship on a grand scale.
It is, and on a smaller scale, you see effective industry leaders using rhetoric and symbolic actions all the time to redefine identities during major organizational change, trying to guide employees to adopt a new sense of we-ness aligned with the company's new direction.
Okay. And what about charisma? We often think of charisma as this inherent, almost magical gift that certain special leaders possess, something that just emanates from them. Does the social identity approach challenge that too?
It absolutely does. It offers a radically different perspective. Instead of charisma being some inherent special gift residing solely within the individual leader.
What is it then?
A social identity approach suggests charisma is actually an emergent product of these self-categorization processes we've been talking about. It arises from a leader's ability to successfully define or redefine a group's identity and objectives in a way that profoundly enhances the shared self-concept of its members.
So the magic isn't just in the leader. It's in their ability to articulate a vision that elevates the collective us.
Precisely. The leader taps into, articulates, and advances a sense of shared identity that resonates deeply with followers, making them feel part of something meaningful and special.
So charisma is actually conferred by followers. It reflects the dynamic, the relationship between the leader and the group. That's a huge shift in perspective from seeing it as just a personal trait.
It is a huge shift. Research supports this view. Studies show that leaders who are perceived as highly prototypical of the group are also perceived by followers as more charismatic and more persuasive.
Ah, the link to prototypicality again.
Yes. And crucially, charisma seems to be linked to actual organizational success only if the leader also consistently promoted a valued group identity. Essentially, if they were consistently seen by followers as doing it for us, embodying our shared goals, and acting in the group's best interest.
So followers don't just confer charisma on anyone who's successful. It's contingent on that leader-group identity match.
It seems deeply contingent on the leader's behavior aligning with the social identity they are expected to represent and enhance. This also helps explain why sometimes when a leader leaves a particular group or context, their perceived charisma often seems to disappear or diminish significantly.
Because it was tied to that specific group identity dynamic, not just to them as an individual.
Exactly. It was a product of that relationship.
This is truly transformational thinking about leadership. It suggests that when we attribute charisma to figures like, say, Nelson Mandela or Martin Luther King Jr., or maybe Barack Obama, we're not just admiring their individual qualities, impressive as they might be. We're also, perhaps primarily, acknowledging their profound role in redefining our collective identity, helping us see a new we-ness, inspiring us to new forms of social behavior, often transforming society itself in the process.
It is transformational leadership in the truest sense. Because the leader doesn't just forge a new path themselves, but their behavior, their vision, their identity entrepreneurship motivates followers to contribute creatively, both to a collective redefinition of self and to pursuing profoundly new forms of social and organizational behavior. It unlocks collective potential.
Okay, let's try a classroom example for charisma in school leadership. Think about a new principal arriving at a school. Initially, they might not be seen as particularly charismatic, just, the new boss.
Right, just another administrator.
But imagine if this principal starts articulating a new, really inspiring vision for the school. Maybe something like, we are a community dedicated to fostering innovation and creativity where every student's unique genius is celebrated.
Okay, a compelling identity narrative.
Yeah. And then, crucially, they consistently act in ways that promote that vision. Maybe they secure funds for a new STEM lab or an art studio. They publicly celebrate student inventions or artistic creations at assemblies. They empower teachers to experiment with new, creative pedagogies.
They're living the vision, making it real.
Exactly. As they do this, they'll increasingly be seen by teachers, students, parents as embodying that new, positive identity for the school. And the community will collectively start to confer charisma upon them, not because of some inherent personality trait they possessed all along, but because the principal has successfully advanced a valued shared identity for the entire school community, making everyone feel part of something special, hopeful, and meaningful. The charisma emerges from that shared identity work.
That's a fantastic illustration of charisma as an emergent property of the leader-group relationship driven by identity.
Okay, moving on from leadership, let's look at motivation. Traditional theories here often focus on individual needs and rewards, right? Things like Maslow's hierarchy, achieving personal goals, getting individual bonuses or recognition.
Yeah, the focus is very much on the individual worker, their needs, their goals, what sustains their effort.
But modern work, and especially education, it feels so collaborative. Teachers work in teams, students learn in groups. The whole school functions as this interconnected system. It seems like motivation has to be about more than just the I. How does identity reshape our understanding of what motivates people at work or school?
You're absolutely right. Those traditional theories, while useful in some contexts, often fall short in explaining motivation in highly collaborative environments. Because as you say, motivation is often as much about we as it is about I. And a social identity approach provides a really robust framework to explain exactly how people can conceive of themselves and act either as separate individuals or as part of a collective. And crucially, how that shift in self-perception impacts what actually motivates them.
So to understand someone's motivations at a particular moment, it's useful to reflect on that question again. Who do you think you are right now? Am I thinking of myself as me or as us? Because the answer can lead to very different motivational drivers.
Exactly. When personal identity is salient, when you're primarily thinking of yourself as a unique individual, people are indeed often motivated by things like personal advancement, individual growth, achieving their own unique potential. Things like self-actualization, individual recognition, maybe mastering a personal skill.
Okay, the classic individual drivers.
But when social identity is salient, when you're thinking of yourself primarily as a group member, part of a team, part of the school motivation shifts significantly. People are then driven more by things like social self-esteem, wanting the group to be viewed positively, by the need for relatedness, feeling connected to others, by peer recognition within the group, and critically, by the achievement of group goals.
So doing it for the team becomes a real motivator, or doing it for the school.
A very powerful motivator. People will often work incredibly hard, even make personal sacrifices if they feel it contributes to the success and positive image of a group they strongly identify with.
And self-categorization theory, SCT, it explains when these different levels of self-categorization, personal versus social, become salient, which in turn determines which set of needs or goals guides our behavior in that moment.
That's right. And importantly, it suggests no higher level needs, like Maslow's self-actualization, are inherently superior or always dominant. What motivates you depends on which level of self is currently active.
It sounds like people can even trade motivators, depending on the context, like we discussed with the strategies for low-status groups.
That's a key insight that flows from this. For example, if group boundaries are seen as permeable and there's a clear possibility of individual promotion or advancement, people in lower status positions might be highly motivated to work hard individually to improve their own standing. Their personal identity goals are driving them.
Right, individual mobility motivation.
But if those boundaries seem impermeable, if individual advancement seems blocked, their motivation often shifts. They might become highly motivated to focus on collective group advancement, working hard for the group's success, even if it means personal sacrifice. Because now their social identity, their sense of self derived from the group, is paramount, and the group's success is their success.
Okay. And how does this play out in terms of identification with the school itself, the whole organization, versus maybe smaller teams within it, like a grade level team? Does strong identification predict certain positive behaviors in schools?
Absolutely. There's a lot of research showing that strong identification with an organization like a school consistently predicts a range of really positive behaviors. Things like lower teacher turnover rates, which is a huge issue in education.
Definitely.
Also, stronger adherence to the school's core values, and a greater willingness among staff to perform those extra role duties, going above and beyond what's explicitly required in their job description, helping out colleagues, volunteering for committees, staying late to prepare for a school event.
And why is that? Is it just about liking the school?
It goes deeper than just liking it. It's because strong identification involves actually internalizing the organization's goals and values. They become your goals and values to some extent. So you're not just motivated by external incentives or rewards. You're intrinsically motivated to see the organization succeed because its success feels like your success.
The source mentions that study about university alumni identification, predicting donations and sending their own kids there. They're still invited in the we of their alma mater years later.
Exactly. That identity endures and continues to motivate behavior.
That makes intuitive sense for the whole organization. But crucially, the research you mentioned earlier also finds that employees often identify more strongly with their immediate work group or team, like their department or project team, than with the larger organization as a whole, especially within a big place. Is that generally true for schools, too?
Yes, that's a really key finding with significant practical implications for schools. While identification with the whole school is important, identification with the immediate work group, like a specific grade level team or a subject department in a secondary school, is often an even better predictor of day-to-day outcomes.
Like what kind of outcomes?
Things like daily job satisfaction, feelings of involvement, and intention to stay in the job. And perhaps most powerfully, work group identification seems to be much better at predicting that extra role helping behavior. Things like staying late specifically to help a teammate finish report cards, or sharing teaching materials freely within the team, or doing unpaid overtime for the group's benefit, even if it doesn't directly benefit one's individual career or get noticed by the principal.
Wow, so that immediate team-we-ness can be incredibly potent for driving that selfless contribution and daily motivation.
It really highlights that while building a strong school-wide identity is important, fostering strong, positive identities within those smaller face-to-face teams might be even more crucial for day-to-day functioning, collaboration, and preventing burnout.
Okay, let's try a classroom example, pulling this together about motivating students and staff. Think about motivating your students. For some kids, it's clearly about individual grades, personal achievement, getting that gold star on the chart. That's their personal identity driving them. They want their name at the top.
Right, motivated by individual success.
But for others, especially maybe in a project-based learning setting where collaboration is really emphasized, the motivation might be much more about the success of their science squad completing a challenging experiment together, or their debate team winning the school competition. That's social identity motivation kicking in.
They're driven by the collective outcome.
Yeah, they're driven by not wanting to let their teammates down, by the pride of that collective victory, by belonging to that successful is.
And you can see the same dynamic with school staff. If a teacher consistently puts in unpaid overtime, it might not be primarily for personal career advancement or a potential bonus or even direct recognition from the principal.
What else could it be?
It could very well be because of a strong identification with their grade level team. Maybe they're working tirelessly together to ensure the team's shared curriculum plan is absolutely perfect before the deadline. Or they're all pitching in to support a big collective goal, like planning the annual school fair or a major field trip. Their motivation comes from that shared team identity and achieving the team's goals.
So understanding which identity, personal or social, is most salient for an individual student or staff member at a given time really helps tailor motivation strategies, doesn't it? You can appeal to their individual goals and ambitions, sure, but you can also, and maybe often more powerfully, appeal to their sense of collective purpose, belonging, and team achievement.
Absolutely. It gives you more levers to work with.
This also brings up that idea you mentioned earlier, motivation and identity fit. What happens if someone feels like their personal identity, who they feel they really are, doesn't quite fit with the prevailing group identity, maybe the school's culture or the team's norms? Does that impact their motivation?
It absolutely does. Motivation isn't just about identifying with the group. It also depends on how representative or prototypical people feel of that group. Do I see myself fitting in here?
Okay.
Those who perceive themselves as being on the periphery, or who feel they don't quite fit the group's prototype or the dominant identity, they tend to have lower identification with the group. And consequently, they often experience lower motivation, lower job satisfaction, less engagement.
So feeling like an outsider impacts your drive.
It seems to. For instance, the source discusses research on women in very traditionally male-dominated professions like surgeons or police officers.
Right, we touched on that.
Studies found they often showed lower ambition within the profession and a stronger desire to eventually exit it if they perceived a significant lack of fit between their own identity as a woman and the organizational prototype of, say, a typical surgeon or a typical police officer, which might be implicitly or even explicitly male.
And the research sees this not as some inherent lack of motivation on their part.
No, critically, the social identity perspective frames this not as some biological difference or an inherent lack of motivation in women, but as an adaptive response. It's a reaction to the social realities and the identity incongruence they experience within that professional environment. It's harder to be motivated when you feel like you don't truly belong or fit the mold of who is valued.
Okay, let's try a classroom example for teacher motivation and fit. Consider a new teacher joining a school that has a very, very traditional, highly structured culture. Maybe there's a strong emphasis on rote learning, strict discipline, following the textbook to the letter.
Okay, a very established, maybe rigid school identity.
Yeah. But this new teacher, personally, they thrive on innovation. They love flexible teaching methods, student-centered learning, inquiry-based projects. That's their identity as an educator.
So a potential mismatch with the school's dominant identity.
Exactly. If this teacher feels that their personal identity as a progressive educator and their core teaching philosophy just doesn't fit with the school's prototypical teacher identity, what's expected, what's valued, how things are done around here, they might experience significantly lower job satisfaction. They might feel disengaged, maybe even start looking for a new position after just a year or two.
Even if they love teaching itself.
Right. It's not necessarily because they're less motivated to teach in general, but because they constantly struggle to reconcile their personal professional identity with the school's dominant organizational identity. The we of the school, its established norms, its expectations, its culture, doesn't align comfortably with their personal who I am as a teacher.
Yeah.
And that persistent lack of fit can really drain motivation and make it hard to fully engage and thrive.
That illustrates the importance of fit very clearly. It's not just if you identify, but how well you feel you fit within that identity.
Okay, this is incredibly insightful for understanding leadership and motivation through the lens of identity. Finally, let's talk about stress. We so often think of stress as this purely individual burden, right? Something to be managed with personal coping strategies like mindfulness apps, exercise, maybe individual counseling.
Yeah, the dominant narrative is very individualistic. Your stress is your problem to solve.
But this research seems to point to stress being a deeply group phenomenon as well. Something interwoven with the very fabric of our social connections, our group memberships.
That's right. Traditional approaches, as you say, typically regard stress primarily as a problem of and for the individual to be remedied by these isolated interventions. But a social identity approach fundamentally challenges this view.
How so?
It suggests that our group memberships are absolutely central to people's experiences of and reactions to social and environmental stressors. Stress isn't just something that happens to individuals within groups. It's often deeply interwoven with the very existence of groups and an individual's membership in them.
So our identities shape how we even experience stress.
Profoundly. Our social identities shape our sense of self, our feelings of belonging, our perceived worth, our sense of purpose. And critically, they determine whether stressful conditions overwhelm us individually or whether we actually combine with others in our group to collaboratively change those stressful conditions for the better. The group can be the source of stress, but also the source of resilience.
So identity plays a role right from the beginning in how we initially appraise a threat. This is the primary stress appraisal stage, right?
Right.
Assessing whether something out there is harmful or challenging.
Exactly. Primary appraisal. And the theory argues that if a person's social identity is salient at the time they encounter a potential stressor, their appraisal of that stressor will be profoundly influenced by their in-group's perspective and condition. How threatening something feels depends heavily on how the self is defined at that moment as an individual me or as part of a collective itsy.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. The source mentions some fascinating research with female sportswomen. They were asked to rate the stressfulness of different potential events. What they found was that the women rated a potential knee injury as significantly more stressful when their sports identity was made salient beforehand.
Because it directly threatened their ability to perform in their core group activities.
Precisely. But interestingly, they rated a potential facial scar as more stressful when their gender identity was made salient, because in that context, it potentially impacted their self-perception as a woman more directly. The identity that was most prominent at the time dictated what they perceived as more threatening and consequently more stressful.
Wow. So the same event can feel more or less stressful depending on which hat you're wearing, which identity is active.
Exactly, and it goes even further. Research suggests that if you identify more strongly with the source of the stressor, you actually respond more positively, or at least less negatively.
That seems totally counterintuitive. If my team is stressing me out, I feel better about it.
It sounds odd, but think about it this way. Stressors that seem to emanate from a source with which you strongly identify, like maybe challenging requests from your teammates to put in extra unpaid overtime to meet a critical collective deadline.
Okay.
Those are often perceived as more self-generated, more meaningful, maybe more controllable than the exact same requests coming from, say, anonymous senior managers whom you don't identify with at all.
Because it feels like we are choosing this challenge versus they're imposing it on us.
That's the idea. And this finding has been consistently supported in studies across various professions: call
Right.
center workers, airline pilots, office workers, and importantly for our discussion, school teachers as well. Requests from highly identified with teams feel different than demands from distant authorities.
That's really interesting.
Furthermore, think about shared responses to widespread stressors, like maybe concerns about air quality in a building,
Yeah.
sick building syndrome, or repetitive strain injuries in an office. These often emerge and spread within work communities, reflecting a shared social identity. People talk to their peers, their in-group members to make sense of the situation, and they form these shared understandings. The air is stale in here, or these work demands are unreasonable.
So the group collectively defines the stressor.
Yes, and that collective definition shapes the individual's experience of it. Research even showed that students' reported stress levels were reduced by receiving a positive message about an upcoming difficult task, only if that positive message came from a fellow in-group member. A positive message from an out-group member had no effect.
Wow. The messenger matters as much as the message because of identity. Okay, let's try a classroom example for primary stress appraisal. Imagine a school district introduces a brand new, incredibly complex state assessment system. It requires huge changes to curriculum, teaching methods, everything. A major stressor.
Okay, universally stressful on the surface.
Right. Now, if the teachers in a particular school strongly identify as a cohesive teaching staff, maybe they have a history of tackling challenges together, supporting each other. They might collectively appraise this new assessment system as, yes, difficult, but ultimately a manageable challenge.
We can handle this together.
Exactly. They'd talk to each other, share strategies, maybe find humor in it, collectively define it as our challenge to overcome. And they'd feel empowered by their shared capacity, their collective efficacy. But contrast that with a school where there's low group cohesion. Teachers feel isolated, maybe there's mistrust between grade levels or departments. They primarily see themselves as individual practitioners.
Okay, low identification.
In that school, the exact same new assessment system might be appraised very differently. It could be seen as an overwhelming individual threat, leading to much higher personal stress, anxiety, feelings of being overburdened. They'll still talk to their peers, of course, but if the shared understanding that forms is more like, this is an impossible burden being placed on me, then that individual experience of stress is dramatically amplified by the lack of a supportive group perspective.
The shared identity, or lack thereof, shapes the initial perception of the threat. Makes sense. Now moving to secondary stress appraisal. This is about assessing one's capacity to cope with the stressor once it's been identified.
Right. Do I have the resources to handle this?
Exactly. And social identity is also absolutely crucial here, particularly through the lens of social support. A shared identity significantly increases people's willingness to provide help and various forms of support: practical help, emotional comfort, useful information to fellow in-group members. We tend to help us more readily and more effectively than them. Research on bystander intervention, for instance, shows that people are much more likely to intervene and help a stranger in distress if they perceive that stranger shares a social identity with them.
Like wearing the same sports team jersey, maybe.
Could be something as simple as that, yes. And crucially, the likelihood of receiving support, and perhaps even more importantly, interpreting that support as genuinely helpful and well-intentioned, depends heavily on whether there's a shared identity between the provider and the recipient.
Ah, so the support actually lands properly.
Yes. As the source notes, there's considerable potential for misinterpretation or even resentment of social support attempts when the salient identities of the provider and recipient are not matched. Advice from an outsider, even if well-meaning, might feel like criticism or interference, while the exact same advice from a trusted in-group member feels like genuine support and solidarity.
That's a really subtle but important point.
And the shared identity support mechanism plays a key role in buffering groups from adverse threats. It's been shown to be protective for low-status groups experiencing discrimination, like ethnic minority groups or Black Americans facing prejudice. They often draw significant strength and resilience from their shared identity and the mutual support within the group.
They find strength in us.
Exactly. The source also highlights how different occupational groups' collective experiences normalize their specific work stresses. Bar staff become relatively unfazed by the intense social pressures and occasional chaos of bar work, while bomb disposal experts become accustomed to the immense physical danger of their job. Why? Because the meaning of the stressor is defined and managed within the context of their work group identity and their shared experience. They normalize it together, support each other through it, developing specific coping norms.
Okay, let's try a classroom example for secondary stress appraisal and coping. Think about a first-year teacher. They're often overwhelmed, right? The sheer volume of grading, demanding parent communications, constant student needs, it can be incredibly stressful.
Definitely a high-stress period.
Now, if this first-year teacher is part of a really supportive grade-level team, one with a strong shared identity, maybe they meet regularly, they share resources openly, they genuinely check in on each other, they have team lunches.
A cohesive we.
Yeah. Then experienced colleagues on the team might offer practical tips. Here's a faster way to grade those essays. They might share resources. Use my lesson plan for tomorrow, save yourself some time. Or they might simply provide crucial emotional support during difficult weeks. We've all been there, you're doing great, vent all you need to. This shared social identity enables truly effective social support, buffering that new teacher from burnout.
The we provides the coping resources.
Exactly. But now imagine that same first-year teacher in a school without that strong team identity. Maybe teachers work in isolation, doors closed. Even if an administrator offers well-intentioned advice, have you tried using this grading rubric? It might feel like criticism, evaluation, or just another demand rather than genuine support.
Because the identities aren't matched.
Precisely. Because the identities of the provider, administrator, maybe seen as management, or an outsider to the daily classroom struggle, and the recipient, isolated new teacher, are not matched in a way that fosters deep trust and shared understanding. The support isn't perceived as coming from one of us for one of us, so it doesn't land effectively and might even add to the stress.
That really highlights the importance of identity match in social support effectiveness. And finally, the ultimate manifestation of this connection between identity and stress is the idea of lack of social identity as a basis for burnout.
Burnout. That state of chronic stress, emotional exhaustion, feeling a profound lack of accomplishment, maybe becoming cynical or callous toward your work and the people you work with. You're saying that's directly linked to low social identification.
The research points strongly in that direction. The source mentions a study conducted in an organization suffering from high levels of burnout. What they found was that low levels of social identification, both with the immediate work team and with the organization as a whole, were very strong predictors of burnout symptoms among employees.
And it was mediated by a lack of social support.
Exactly. The lack of identification led to a perceived lack of social support, which in turn led to higher burnout. It suggests burnout isn't just an individual failing. It's often rooted in a breakdown of collective identity and the support systems that come with it.
This was powerfully demonstrated in that famous BBC prison study, wasn't it? By Haslam and Riker.
Ah, yes, the BBC prison study. A fascinating, if controversial, piece of research from the mid-2000s. They randomly assigned participants to roles of prisoners and guards in a specially constructed, simulated prison environment and observed them for, I believe, 8 days.
And what happened regarding identity and stress?
It was quite dramatic. As events unfolded, the prisoners started to develop a stronger and stronger shared social identity. They united against the guards, supported each other, and this increasing social identification actually led to greater resistance to the inherent strain of the situation, the confinement, the poor conditions, and paradoxically, it also fueled their willingness to challenge and impose strain on the guards. For the prisoners, high identification seemed associated with more positive stress outcomes in that context, a kind of eustress, or positive motivating stress, as they collectively fought for their rights and identity within the simulation.
So uniting as S made them stronger and more resilient. What about the guards? Did they unite too?
That's the crucial contrast. The guards largely failed to develop a shared identity. They became increasingly isolated. They disagreed on how to run the prison. They failed to support each other effectively. And this declining shared identity led directly to profound distress, internal conflict, feelings of powerlessness, and ultimately collective burnout among the guards. They couldn't effectively manage the situation, partly because they weren't functioning as a cohesive group. Each guard became, in effect, an isolated individual overwhelmed by the escalating stress and the challenge from the unified prisoners.
Wow. That study really demonstrates powerfully that stress isn't simply a problem of individual biology or personality or personal coping mechanisms, is it?
Not primarily, no. It suggests stress is fundamentally a problem of group life, of social identity dynamics. And critically, the study also implies that group life, that shared identity, is also the key to its amelioration to building resilience.
The prisoners showed how a strong shared identity helps individuals resist strain, maybe even turn adversity into advantage by acting collectively.
While the guards, tragically in the context of the study, showed how the erosion or failure of social identity exposes individuals to overwhelming stress, leading to collective failure and individual burnout. It really confirms that stress isn't just an individual issue, it's profoundly a problem of group life. And the solution, or at least a major buffer, often lies within the group too, in the strength of its shared identity and the mutual support it provides.
Okay, let's bring this home with a final classroom example on burnout in the school community. Think about a school where teachers genuinely feel isolated. Maybe there's very little sense of shared purpose among the staff, or perhaps strong cliques and divisions between grade levels or departments.
The fragmented community.
Yeah, a palpable lack of positive social identification among teachers means less genuine social support, fewer shared understandings of common stressors, less collective problem solving. And this can lead directly to widespread teacher burnout. Just like the guards in the BBC prison study, if teachers don't feel part of a cohesive, supportive us, if they perceive themselves primarily as individual islands facing this ocean of demands.
They get overwhelmed alone.
Exactly. They're left to face overwhelming demands, largely alone, leading to exhaustion, disengagement, cynicism, and that painful sense of profound lack of accomplishment. Conversely, imagine a school with a strong, positive sense of community, where teachers feel deeply connected, valued, supported by their colleagues and the administration, where there's a real sense of we're all in this together.
A strong collective identity.
That kind of environment, where social identification is high, can be the most powerful buffer against job-related stress and burnout. It doesn't make the challenges disappear, but it makes them feel manageable because they are faced together as a unified, supportive we.
It fundamentally changes the experience of the work.
Absolutely. So in conclusion then, this deep dive really shows that these identity processes, they aren't just peripheral kind of abstract psychological concepts. They are truly central, absolutely fundamental to understanding organizational dynamics, especially in a dynamic, human-centered place like a school.
That's right. This whole approach really questions those static, individualistic views of people and organizations. It reveals how context is continually redefining both the properties of the organization itself and our own profound sense of self within it. It highlights that the who we are is constantly in flux, always being shaped by the who we are with and who we perceive ourselves to be in relation to others.
It's that core dialectic you mentioned earlier, isn't it? The organizational world shapes who we are, but who we are and who we want to be also shapes the organizational world. It's this constant two-way street, this ongoing negotiation between self and group.
Precisely. And the practical implications are huge. It means that for any educational leader, a principal, a superintendent, a team leader, or for teachers or even policymakers, actively managing identity isn't just some side task or a soft skill. It's fundamental to achieving any meaningful goals.
So if you want to improve school culture, or boost student outcomes, or enhance teacher retention, or successfully implement new curricula,
Success is far, far more likely when school leaders and teachers consciously try to discover, develop, and work with the relevant social identities at play, rather than ignoring them or, worse, working against them.
Okay.
This means actively fostering a strong, positive sense of we among students within a classroom, among grade-level teams or departments, and across the entire school community. It means taking the time to understand what identities are actually salient for your students and your colleagues in different situations, and understanding how those identities profoundly influence their motivation, their ability to cope with stress, how they perceive leadership, and ultimately how they learn, collaborate, and thrive.
It's such a powerful insight. It really changes how you might approach everything. From designing a simple collaborative group project for students to supporting a struggling colleague, or even just defining your own role and purpose as an educator within the larger system. Understanding these invisible yet incredibly potent forces of identity can genuinely transform your practice and hopefully create a much more vibrant, supportive, and effective learning environment for everyone.
And it creates the space for a far more fruitful dialogue, I think, about what it truly means to build and be part of a vibrant, healthy, and effective school community, shifting the focus from simply managing individuals to actively cultivating a thriving, supportive collective.
So just to recap, we've journeyed today from defining social identity and self-categorization through understanding why we have this fundamental drive to seek positive group identities, how context makes specific identities salient, and finally, how these principles profoundly impact core organizational processes like leadership, motivation, and stress within any organized group, especially schools. It's been truly eye-opening for me.
It really underscores that identity isn't just some abstract psychological concept. It's the very heart of how groups function, how they thrive or sometimes falter, and how they contribute so fundamentally to our individual well-being and sense of self.
So, as you, our listener, step back into your classroom or head into your next staff meeting, maybe consider this. What we-ness, what sense of shared identity are you consciously or unconsciously creating within your space? How is that shared identity shaping not just the individual people within your classroom or school, but the very culture and atmosphere of the classroom or school itself? And perhaps what specific intentional steps could you take, starting small, to build or strengthen a shared identity that fosters even more positive outcomes? More collaboration, more resilience, more motivation for everyone involved.
That's a great reflective question to end on.
That's definitely a lot to mull over. And it really does change how you see the dynamics in any group, doesn't it? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
It's always a pleasure to explore these crucial connections and understand not just what happens in groups, but why it matters so profoundly to our sense of self and our collective success.